After 27 years in prison, he led South Africa's transition from a white minority rule to become the country's first black president. Nearly 2 decades later, dead at the age of 95, Nelson Mandela continues to leave an indelible mark on the world. Joining us now to remember the man and that mark, Radcliffe Dockery. He's a board member at the Canada-South Africa Chamber of Commerce. Jerry Kaplan, author of The Betrayal of Africa, who's been involved in several African initiatives over the past several decades. Dwayne Morgan, spoken word artist and the founder of Up From the Roots Entertainment. Yves Guillaume A. Messi, University of Toronto student. And Doug Saunders, international affairs columnist at the Globe and Mail. And as I welcome the 5 of you here tonight for what I expect will be a memorable discussion about an unforgettable gentleman, we want to remind everybody that we'd like to hear from you on this. So please feel free to weigh in with your thoughts on this historic day in our lives. Twitter chat, go for it. Tell us what you think. Agenda TVO is the hashtag, and we'll put up some of your comments during the course of the program. Nobody around this table met him, but I suspect that doesn't mean that none of you felt that you didn't know him. Okay, let's go. You first.
Yes.
What did you think when you heard the news that Nelson Mandela had finally died?
I was deeply saddened by it. I had brought a group of 15 of us to South Africa earlier this year, and you know, you learn about Nelson Mandela, but when you're actually in South Africa and you can talk with the people and you can actually feel what he has meant to the people, it just meant so much more and it put him in a whole different context for me. So, you know, I knew that he was ill and that this could happen at any time. That didn't make it, you know, an easier pill to swallow. It's still very sad, but there's still so much of a legacy to celebrate, and I'm trying to focus on celebrating the legacy.
Radcliffe.
A tear rolled down my cheek. And Nelson Mandela, because think about it, I was born in the mid-70s. I never got to hear Martin Luther King live or Malcolm X live. Nelson Mandela was the next one. So we actually got to live and see how he, hear him speak live, saw him in Toronto here. So it was a sense of great loss. In that sense of, of the big 3, my mom gave me a little picture when I was a young boy of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Nelson Mandela. So of that big 3 now, the one that I actually got to hear live or see live is gone. So the sense of loss. And also a sense of what Dwayne said, of celebration, that at 95 years old, and personally as well, my grandmother's 95, so it connects to an era of people who stood up, people who stood for what was right, and people who also were very proud of their history and culture.
When you say you saw him live, did you actually see him in person live?
Yeah, I was one of those people packed up, skipped school.
This is when he came to Ontario?
Yes, I was one of those people.
Early 1990s?
I could see him, it was about this small, it's not far back, but I still...
Where'd you see him, at the Skydo?
No, it was at Queen's Park
Queen's
at the time?
Park, well,
yeah.
I think he was at both places.
Yes.
Okay, Yves, your thoughts?
Yeah, I just found that it's very saddening, and you can only focus on the hope that he gives us. Because as a young black student, you can only look up to so many figures, and this was one of the shiniest one. And we can only look back, go through history, and keep the memory of him as we move forward and try to make a difference.
Doug.
It's terribly sad that he's no longer with us, but this is a man who more than anyone else led a complete life. I mean, he was born under terrible authoritarianism, under racial segregation. He suffered under that system more than anyone else. He fought to overthrow it. He overthrew it successfully and peacefully. Then he successfully governed a country in a post-authoritarian way, in a way that became a model for everyone else. And he became the template, really, for how to resist tyranny and to govern afterwards. 2 things that he became the world's template for. So hopefully this will be a moment of memory and of examples.
It's interesting that you say he led a complete life, given that 27 years of that life were spent in jail.
Amazing. I mean, 27 years is the length of many complete lives, and so on. But even during his period in jail, he had become a template for resistance. So he meant, I mean, outside of religion, there are very few people in the world who manage to turn suffering and repression into exemplary models of resistance in that way. It's unique.
Jerry.
He's been part of my life and my family's life for more decades than some of the people around this table have been have lived through. I got to Southern Africa in 1964 at almost exactly the same time he was convicted in the Rivonia trials and sent to prison for the rest of his life. I was in Rhodesia, just to the north, which was a kind of South African colony and a mini South Africa led by whites, and I got deeply involved in the anti-apartheid struggle in Rhodesia, and there were close links between Africans and whites in Rhodesia who were on the progressive side and those in South Africa. So we followed it very closely, and in the years back in Canada, I became deeply involved in the anti-apartheid movement, which is too often forgotten. Maybe we'll come back to that in our conversation. It wasn't politicians who saved South Africa. It was rank and file people who, such as trade unionists. The other thing that's happened in my life is that my wife, who was an activist in the Canadian Auto Workers, got to meet him 4 different times. And we have in our house 4 photographs of Carol with Nelson Mandela. And I've always said if we have a fire, the things I would make sure I got out of the house were those who are photographs, which are more precious than anything else. But the story is important because the trade unions, some in America, almost all in Canada, most in Britain, those in the Nordic countries, were thoroughly supportive throughout the years of the African National Congress, which was Mandela's party, while he was in prison knowing none of this. He was the emblem, he was the guy we were fighting for, but he wasn't doing the fighting. It was people outside doing the fighting on his behalf. And when he came out, he forgot no one, as he himself said, who had helped during the struggle. That's why he went to Libya to see that nutty dictator. He said, I don't care what he does for anything else. He was good to our cause. And so he met the trade unionists wherever he was. When Carol and Bob White went to South Africa, they met there, and when he came here, they met him here. And so that was very exciting. I also heard him speak at a big rally that Peterson and Mulroney ran in Toronto in the 1990s. That's when he embarrassed Brian Mulroney into giving him the money in American coin, not in Canadian coin, because it was worth more. It was quite a wonderful scene.
There's a difference.
Well, there's a big difference. And I was at that Skydo meeting that you talked to when you talked to the kids. And finally, about 3 days after he was released in February 1990, one of those moments like Kennedy's death that we all remember where we exactly were, there was a huge rally on Danforth Avenue. Thousands of people spontaneously showed up. The network, the anti-apartheid network was grand, and they knew it. There was no social media. Nobody Twittered anything. They just showed up at the word field. There were thousands of people in Danforth. I was one of the speakers, and it was a night of euphoria that those of us there will never forget, and maybe will never happen again.
Your connection to him went back 4 decades. Yours didn't. And I'm interested, Eve, in how somebody who, is as young, how old are you?
22.
You're 22. You're a university student.
22.
Jerry has socks that are twice that age. But anyway,
I'm wearing them.
Yeah.
but I want. So it's clearly understandable to me how he could have such an important influence in Jerry Kaplan's life. But you're younger. You didn't live through all of those years when he was in prison. You've only known him, I suspect, since he's been out of prison. Mm-hmm. So why such an important figure in your life?
Well, because growing up in Canada, you look up to a few figures when it comes to the best thing you can be. And it's very clear that Nelson Mandela represented exactly that. He managed to make a life worth living, making life better for his friends, family, and society at large. And if you're a kind of person who cares about doing the exact same thing later on, even in a small way, he'll definitely be the ideal to follow. And I happen to be a student at U of T, and I met Tony Clement, who told me that how he got involved in politics was actually in St. Hilda's Rigby room. He was protesting against apartheid at U of T, at Trinity College. So it's something that we look up to, and it's something that we learn to keep an ear out from to understand exactly how you go about achieving what's right for others.
You are how old, Dwayne?
Pushing 40.
You're pushing 40.
I am.
Oh, you look terrific. I thought you were 10 years younger than that.
Well, I'll take it.
Okay. The place Mandela had in your home as you were growing up, was it a subject of conversation in your home?
It was a topic, when we look at race, when we look at, the plight of black people around the world, he definitely came up as another example. When you look at racism, it's often very easy to only look at, the American context. My family's from Jamaica, so it was very important that, my family taught us about, the struggles in Jamaica, but also to take that a Pan-African view and look at, the struggles of black people in other places. And as, was said by some of the other panelists, really just looking at him as, someone who went through so much and still was able to come out with love and compassion and empathy for those who, stole so much from him. And, the greatest legacy is really, the fact that he lived his life to give to other people. And as much as he could, all he did was just give. And I think that's such a beautiful thing.
Doug, that's the thing we need to understand better. How is it a man who had every right to be so angry and embittered with the world over the treatment he had personally experienced, how does he emerge from jail this serene figure who doesn't get even with his enemies, but embraces them and urges everybody else to do the same? Where does that come from?
This is the great success. I mean, there have been plenty of people who've led liberation struggles and movements to overthrow oppressive regimes who've succeeded at that. And there have been people who've governed successfully in post-authoritarian, newly liberated democratic societies with greater or lesser degrees of success. For Mandela to have done both was quite an accomplishment because he shifted gears and he had to make some compromises. He had to betray his party, many of whom wanted an authoritarian economic system and national industries and these sort of things. And he had to shift gears there and say, okay, if we actually want to have social justice, we need a functioning economy, we need investment, we need to have a stable country, and we have to stop being revolutionaries. And we also have to have this truth and reconciliation process, which isn't necessarily the same as the kind of justice that revolutionaries might want against the people who've made them and their families suffer for years and years. I was thinking the only similar example I can think in modern history was Henrique Cardoso, the Brazilian president from the 1990s, who himself went from a radical revolutionary ideology that got him into power to being a great manager of equality and economic growth while governing. That's a very, very hard change to make, and it involves being uncompromising and maybe not making your supporters happy all the time.
Well, I wonder if some of his more left-wing friends of yours were a little ticked at him with that.
Well, they were, and they still are. But let me describe two characteristics that I think we don't always associate with him. Number one, I believe the question is, how did he survive 27 years in jail at all? And the second is, how did he come out apparently so serene? The answer, I think, is, from people who knew him well, is that he had what we don't really talk about much, a genuine sense of his own destiny. He believed he was going to win. He always thought he was going to get out of jail. I never thought I'd see him alive again. He came out in February '90. My wife and I cried because we thought we'd never see him alive, as most people. He always thought he would get out, and he always thought he'd get out to do what you said he was going to do. So there was a sense of destiny that we don't always associate. The second was, I don't think we realize how steely and tough he was. He did everything he did, not because he was soft and compassionate, but because he knew he couldn't save the country otherwise. And so he made some of those terrible compromises, and he made them consciously. One is he gave up. He knew that he had to keep white economic power, or the country would go down the drain. Right. And therefore, as Doug says, he almost unilaterally threw out the entire socialist economic agenda. For some of us, on the one hand, it worked, I think. It kept the country together. On the other hand, it's led to it being one of the most unequal countries in the world. Number two, he allowed the whites to continue to have control of the public service. He gave a guarantee to all the white bureaucrats who had these great cushy jobs. Otherwise, they would have sabotaged the country. As it is, they were where they were, and they did sabotage the country while he was the government. And number three, as Doug says, he brought in the Reconciliation Commission, which is a way of saying to the whites, we're not just going to beat you all up. We're not going to throw you in jail. We're going to do it all open and publicly. And it caused great rifts everywhere, but he stood up to it because He thought that that was the most important thing to keep the country together, and I believe that was his greatest single contribution. He prevented an impossibly vicious, deadly civil war in South Africa.
I mean, that is a fact. There were not tens of thousands of people killing each other in the streets, which he deserves enormous credit for. Isn't that right?
He does. There's no question about it. He deserves enormous credit for it. And you think about, if I was in that situation, would I have been as serene as Nelson Mandela was? Would most of us be? And so we give him respect for that. He kept the country together. He kept it moving. And he only served one term. We see a lot of times when new presidents get in power, I'm never leaving this place. He stayed there.
Some people think that's a mistake, Radcliffe,
Yeah,
that he needed another 5 years.
Yeah, he may have needed another 5 years. We could debate
maybe
that, maybe, but the fact that he did that. But to your point, Jerry, about where we are today in South Africa, a lot of us who studied history from a Pan-Africanist point of view, we studied history of what happened in South Africa, same with what happened in Rhodesia, what happened in Angola when the South African army was approaching Angola, and Cuba had to intervene and do something there as well to prevent them from spreading, and how the U.S. was behind a lot of this chess playing going on around that time. And now we look at today, the economic inequality hasn't changed much. There's still this huge gap, and the few blacks who are successful because, quite honestly, they got government contracts. And there's a huge split in the ANC right now against Jacob Zuma. So they have the youth wing saying, let's nationalize the resource industry. And there's a lot of investors scared. So they're trying to play this line right now in South Africa today. So for the time where Mandela came out of jail, did he do the right thing or not? That's revisionist history. At the time, he kept the country together, and he tried to keep it moving forward.
There's always a danger, though. This guy was so extraordinary and so special that there's a sense there's a deification around him that went on. And I'm just wondering on this issue of whether he should have done another term, the longer you're there, the more that people think they can't live without you. And he may have seen it as his role to ensure a stable transition so that this deification didn't get deeper roots.
It's not the first election, it's the second
right.
one.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I have to say, Mandela had a choice of going the easy way or the right way. I think he went with the right way by leaving office after one term, because in Africa right now we have this prize called the Mo Ibrahim Prize for presidential leadership.
Right.
And he would still win it. The Mo Ibrahim Prize is not always given out because there's such a dearth.
Tell what it is.
It's a prize that rewards excellence in presidential leadership all over the continent to further democracy, economic stability, and lack of conflict. Now,
in other words, Mo will give you a lot of money if you're a political leader.
I think it's something. It's a few $1 million.
It's a few million bucks to leave.
Who funds that?
He does.
He does. He's a very rich businessman who wanted to show economic promise for encouraging good leadership on the continent.
Peaceful transition.
But Mandela showed the right example. That's exactly what we need on the continent. People who are able to turn around the economy and the political system in such a way that we can have a continuity, stability. That's what the continent still needs at this point. It's one of the questions that, unfortunately, Nelson Mandela leaves still unanswered.
I think, Doug, though, it's worth remembering that he had a partner in his efforts, and that partner was a white guy named F.W. de Klerk. The argument is Mandela couldn't have done what he did had de Klerk not been prepared to let him out of jail and be a partner in peace. Do you believe that?
There has to be some credit there. De Klerk was a very problematic person. It was not all sunny and rosy.
Of course, well, he kept him in jail too.
On the basic headline fact that when eventually he, realized that his numbers were up and decided to release him, he did it in a way that was an orderly transition, that allowed a full election. Bumps on the road on the way there, but look, as you said, considering how transitions have taken place in so many other countries, not just in the African continent, but in other continents, the lack of, there were a few bombs set off by white extremists, I think, right before the first election, and that was about it. There was not a civil war. There was some disorder and violence, but it was not official political violence or anything like that.
Jerry, you prepared to give de Klerk his due on this day?
Sure, but because he saw the realities that couldn't be escaped, it was only a matter of time by 1990 before the whites understood what de Klerk understood, what his predecessors didn't, that the sanctions were working, that business was not going to invest anymore. not because they had any moral concern about apartheid one way or another, but there was just too much disruption in the country. That what civil society groups, what anti-apartheid groups, what activist groups were doing all over the world was hurting. And if it wasn't hurting the pocketbook directly, it was meaning it was a message that we were never going to give up. This little country, and it is a little country compared to the rest of the world, was never going to stop being harassed by the rest of the world unless they did the right thing, and de Klerk recognized that. It was very grudging, but he then made the next smart move. When he did it all the way. He freed all the political parties. Didn't have to do that at all. He didn't only let out Mandela, he let all the comrades out. He let all the comrades back into the country who had been out of the country for 15 or 20 or 30 years. And that was a major move. Now, he worked as hard as he could, which was what he was supposed to do for the next 4 years, to make sure the whites had as much power as possible. And in those remember that it took 4 years from Mandela's release from prison before the election of April 1994, before they had a constitution they could agree on. So there was a miserable tussle in all those years as to who was going to rule, and de Klerk did his best to make sure, as I said, the whites got power. And that was, and he succeeded in a great number of those things. In the process, he alienated Mandela any number of times. And when they finally both won the Nobel Prize, it was kind of grudging on both sides to get together. But look, that's a detail now.
And
so
de Klerk is alive today and sang his praises today, sang Mandela's praises today,
well,
as would be appropriate.
That's another question. You'll go around the table with it. Everybody is singing his praises today, whatever they thought of him 20 years ago.
Let me get into that, because you're taking me exactly where I want to go next. Dwayne, to you first. When Mandela did visit Canada, there was a conservative backbencher, I guess in the opposition at the time, who said, or was he in government at the time? I guess he must have been on the governing side at the time, who said, Mandela's a communist and a terrorist. What did you think when you heard that?
It wasn't surprising. I think, typically, when there have been, black leaders who have been trying to be, progressive, they have been, called all sorts of things. So, I mean, that was probably a nice thing that they called him.
In Canada, though? By a member of parliament in Canada to call him a terrorist and a communist?
I was born here, so this is, for me, in the skin that I'm in, this is not surprising at all. I think it's very interesting now, so many years later, that so many people, think so differently, and some of those same people who might have thought that would never say those things out loud, today, or even admit that that's what they thought back then. And Mandela hasn't changed who he is. He didn't change, what his mission, what his duty, to the planet was. He was always trying to do the same thing all the time. But it's just very interesting that so many people's perceptions of him have now changed. And now that he's gone, everyone's going to be on the bandwagon, and nobody wants to be, caught saying any negative things right now.
Yves?
No, I have to say something here. Whoever said this, and I hope this was not today or recently, because it should have been
20 years ago.
Okay, good, exactly, because this no longer represents what the Conservatives are probably trying to go with these days. I mean, you see a lot of minority leaders in the Conservative Party now compared to 20 years back then. So unfortunately, it shows that particular leader, even in Canada, was behind his times. Because I'm pretty sure 20 years ago already, there was already a strong civil rights movement that had run its course.
You know what? Let me just interrupt for a second to say, somebody in the control room, do me a favor, Google this for us, because I think I remember who the guy was, but I don't want to say his name.
I think I know who it was.
It was Rob Anders. Okay.
Rob Anders, 2001, said it in the House of Commons. He still sits in the House of Commons.
Yeah, I wasn't 100% sure of that.
Well, he sits behind his times.
He sits behind his
Let me
times.
say something to that as well. Like Dwayne, I'm born and bred here. I'm Jamaican background. There's a deep connection to Africa through the reggae music we grew up with. That taught us a lot about Zimbabwe, South Africa, apartheid, Nelson Mandela. And let me say this, a lot of people today, we're remembering Madiba. We're remembering a great life, what he's left us as a legacy on this earth. However, Dwayne and I were talking about this in the hallway just a second ago, there are going to be people 2 weeks from now going to revert back to some of the same discriminatory behavior that they exhibited before they heard the news today. So Nelson Mandela is just not about a person who came out of jail for 27 years. He represents a continued struggle for justice, for what's right. So last week when the stats came out, that 69% increase of black males in our federal prisons came out. Mandela would care about that issue. When it comes out that corporate corporate boards have less visible minorities than ever before. Nelson Mandela would address that issue. So it's not about sending a tweet out and a nice statement today saying, oh, we feel bad about Nelson Mandela, he was a great person. What are you going to do tomorrow? What are you going to do next week? The same principles that he put his life on the line for, and Winnie Mandela and Steve Biko, what they put their life on the line for, what are you going to do now? So today, we're going to remember his memory, but to really take his memory forward is to address the social and economic injustice around the world. As a Black Canadian, our issues have to be addressed. And I think that's how I look at how to take his legacy and move forward with it. He stood up, and we're going to keep standing and bringing issues up as Canadian citizens to keep the legacy of Nelson Mandela forward. But so today, give me the nice speech. Tomorrow, I want action. That's what he stood for.
I like what Radcliffe is saying, and Dwayne, I'm not sure what people are celebrating, a lot of them tonight. I'm not sure exactly what part of Nelson Mandela they're cheering on and are so sentimental about. He was, as I said, tough, and he was tough in the fight for social justice and equality in a way that many people in the world today don't share whatsoever, and didn't share while he was alive. The problem with what you said is he was a communist, or at least a Marxist, all the time he was in prison, or he thought he was. The party was a Marxist party, and he was a terrorist, or at least the party explicitly supported terror as a strategy of fighting apartheid. And many people in the world, including many Canadians, including some of our governments who are today remembered for supporting very well, never accepted. Mulroney was never happy about it, although he was the best prime minister we ever had on it. And Joe Clark, who was the foreign minister, was explicitly very unhappy about it and never forgot and never allowed Mandela to forget that he had to give up so-called terrorism before Joe Clark was prepared to recognize the African National Congress. That was a reality. But you also know that not everybody in the world at the time was so hot about him. The entire Ronald Reagan government was pivoted on...
Margaret Thatcher, too.
The Reagan CIA guy used to travel frequently to Pretoria and Joburg to meet with secret intelligence operatives in South Africa working together. They finally fought together, as you said, trying to Angola. And Thatcher was openly pro-apartheid. I'm not sure she was a racist, as some people say, but as far as she was concerned, the protection of British business interests
for sure.
in South Africa, which were very, very serious, was much more important to her than any stupid damn fight about equality. And we can't forget that he was not the beloved person all his life as he is today.
Doug, it's also worth remembering, though, that Brian Mulroney and Margaret Thatcher had some terrific fights over his efforts to get her to move closer to his position, which eventually she did, right?
Yeah, Canada's position was not golden. I mean, our resource companies ignored the sanctions and continued to do business in South Africa throughout the entire period. Brian Mulroney does deserve some credit, though, because he was the leader of a conservative government during a time when certainly all the conservative governments in the English-speaking world and others across the Western world were supporting the apartheid regime for a variety of reasons. Some, like Reagan, for classic Cold War reasons. They believed that the ANC would stay true to its communist principles and would join the Eastern Bloc. Some, like Thatcher's Britain, for economic self-interest. They realized that their country's resource companies were making a lot of money, important sources of revenue out of South Africa, and that if it was seized by a black radical government, as they saw it, then they would lose that. Others because they were simply racist. And frankly, the question, was that racist? If you were de facto supporting a regime built on the subjection of an entire people, a majority people in the country, for whatever reason, whatever geostrategic reason or economic reason, then yes, that was a racist policy. It was supporting the racial division of one of the world's most important economies.
I do have to say, it's true that there are important historical, there's a strong background to Mandela's life, but I think we shouldn't forget his legacy, because leaders at the time represent the consensus back then, and it's a generation that's unfortunately dying off one person at a time. But here we're celebrating the fact that today we all agree that this was questionable leadership practice. So even though before people were presenting very different consensus about the way blacks should be treated all over the world, I find that today I can't help but find myself preferring today's account instead of looking at sort of yesterday's political hang-ups. Like maybe that's my youth, but
No, but I think,
oh, there you go.
I think though, like even when we're speaking about the whole thing around, the terrorism and that sort of thing, I think language is also, a very important thing. I think when you can, open fire and massacre, hundreds of your own citizens, to me, you're the terrorists. I mean, when those citizens decide that they're going to do something to protect their families, their next generations, those in power then get to say, well, these are the terrorists for defending themselves against this brutality that we have forced them to live in. So, I mean, it's very easy for those in power to say, these are the terrorists, these are terrorist actions and that sort of thing. But to me, the brutality of what Black South Africans had to endure, the massacres that people had to watch, the impact that has on mental health and all of these things, to me, that is terrorism that is being perpetrated and justified by the government at that time.
And that's what they decided in a very conscious, explicit way. And it was only a couple of years after Sharpeville, which was one of the great, terrible, historic massacres, when some 70 Africans were shot in the back by the white coppers. They decided that they were never going to have a chance to end apartheid unless they too resorted to violence, and so they created a separate little entity and then Mandela explicitly approved it, and they started training, and they went to East Germany, and they went to the Soviet Union, and they went to Poland. So while we here were talking about what the Nordic countries did, what Sweden did, which was true, and what we were doing, and what the British Labour Party was doing, half of the African National Congress was busily in the communist world learning how to be fighters, as I think they should have done. In the end, ironically, they had very little success.
Well, by the time he got out, there was no Soviet Union anymore.
Well, that helped too.
It's worth pointing out that from the moment he got out, Mandela went on a diplomatic drive to make it clear to the leaders of the wider world that he was not going to pursue a terrorist path. And I think there was diplomacy.
Couldn't say the words, but that's right.
Well, to make it clear that, and I think as you pointed out, that to the extent that these words were used, they were bargaining chips at that point. They were things to be traded off. I mean, he did win the trust of governments that had no reason to be trusting the ANC. Persuading the wider world that the ANC was a legitimate governing party and not a bunch of communists and terrorists, actually, was quite an accomplishment, actually. It was as big an accomplishment as anything else he did, and then living up to it.
Let me put on the table this notion of, we're going to do a comparison, say, with Lech Wałęsa, who was this radical shipyard trade unionist who led a revolution in Poland and was a legend. And then when he became president, not quite so much a legend anymore. Some similarities there with Mandela insofar as the legend is created and then he becomes a president. Was he a better legend or a better president? What's the thought of the table? Roderick?
Legend versus president? That's a good question. For the times where he had to govern, he was a good president. For what he had to deal with at the time. I spent 27 years in jail. Then we go through this 4-year period of basically saying, we're negotiating, we're still going to screw all your people in the back while we're negotiating with you. Takes over, you have decades of this huge inequality divide, and all of a sudden, now I got to solve the world's problems tomorrow. Just like that. And you study a lot of revolutions. To beat a revolutionary is hard, governing is 10 times harder.
That's what I'm wondering.
Right?
Was he a better revolutionary than he was a president?
Well, most revolutionaries are better revolutionaries. Across history, most of them are. Normally it's that second or third president who has the time now, the perspective and time to look back at the issues. So I would say as a revolutionary, was he better as president? Yes. But at the same time, during his presidency, there was some stability, at least from the external point of view. There's some stability, et cetera. And of course, after presidency, he was a spokesman. I'll give you an example. The movie Malcolm X came out years later, Spike Lee.
Yep.
The end of the Malcolm X movie is Nelson Mandela talking to a bunch of school children. And he quotes the by any means necessary speech, which is fascinating because that speech scared a lot of white people in the USA. And this is Malcolm X after the Nation of Islam. And And in that speech, he says, we will get our freedom by any means necessary. Malcolm X quotes the speech and then says, the students around the room say, I am Malcolm X. And Nelson Mandela looks at the camera and says, I am Malcolm X.
What did you infer from that?
I infer to that he's a Pan-African. And the whole train of thought then is like saying, no, what you were saying earlier. It's not about we're going to pick up guns and shoot people for no reason, but everyone has the right to defend themselves. Everyone has the right to say, if you're going to attack me, and this is policy of the Western world today, if you do something to me, I'm going to do something to you. So the policy there is that Nelson Mandela says, I'm Malcolm X. Well, for me as a young black male, when I remember first seeing Nelson and Malcolm's debate at Oxford College, when he takes them on these great scholars and says to them, you talk about me being violent, how did your society get here? How will you dominate the world's resources? So when Nelson makes that statement, I connect those two to meaning that that's what I connect.
Okay, but, well, Eve, my inference from that would be Malcolm X did not renounce violence. And if
But that's
Nelson,
incorrect.
But
He did.
No, at the end he did. He was more on the Martin Luther King
Yeah,
side.
that's incorrect.
when he was killed.
Before he was
Before
killed.
then.
Well,
One of the reasons he was.
I'd like to say, I see him more, obviously the legend that Mandela is one of the few leaders who were able to reconcile their myth with their reality. Mandela was able to walk on that tightrope, but as a president, he was pretty remarkable because in the first place, the reason why that struggle happened was because of the inequality, the fact that many black citizens were not able to be recognized in the South African economy. And when I look at the black economic empowerment scheme and the 30 years, the 20 years that has been going on, I find that just by doing that, just by reconciling some of the inequalities, he laid a pretty strong foundation for a legacy of equitable change in South Africa. And even if right now the scheme is in trouble, there's a big need for rebalancing on the other end, that's where he shines as a rebel who was able to actually implement credible, visible policy, no pun intended.
Okay, go ahead, Jerry.
These are important to talk about.
You need the context of 94 to 99. He gets into power. He wins this overwhelming election in April 27th, I think, 94. I remember it because it was 3 weeks after the Rwanda genocide began. And so the very worst of Africa and the very best of Africa happened in the same month. It's quite fascinating. And the 20th anniversary of both is imminent next year. First of all, few of his black colleagues trust the whites yet, with good reason. They were sure they were going to be betrayed. They were sure they were going to be sabotaged all over the place. There were small cliques of white terrorists who were openly trying to overthrow the government. He had to deal with that. He had just come through this terrible internecine battle with Buthelezi and the ethnic Zulus, and Buthelezi had been supported by many conservatives in North America and Britain, one of whom has become a prominent Canadian businessman. His name was Conrad Black.
Yes.
Yes. When Buthelezi, he sponsored a trip by Buthelezi here. That's the same time as Buthelezi was sabotaging everything Nelson Mandela was trying to do. So he had to try to deal with all this, and he made himself a president who wasn't interested, that's wrong, who didn't worry about the small stuff, the details. He let all that to his vice presidents, one of whom was Mbeki, who became the president, and he dealt with trying to keep the country together. And I think trying to blame him for anything else is not helpful, although he himself says that one of his greatest failures is he absolutely failed to recognize the severity of the AIDS epidemic, which had already broken out, and he kicks himself
which
for that.
would not make him unique among African leaders.
No, but he's not.
Acknowledging
But he is unique. He's Nelson Mandela.
Well, all right. As long as we're going to be critical here, let me put this on the table. Doug, to you first. His successors have not exactly been Jeffersonian Democrats. Can we put it that way? Should he have done more to speak out against the abuses of his successors?
He did things, but the ANC has fallen apart. That was almost inevitable, I think. It could not live up to Mandela's model. It's had factional struggles. It's had terrible leaders. It's had defection of people into new parties. I would say the next South African election is going to be very interesting because it'll be the first time that the ANC is not a surefire winner. There will be a whole bunch of different parties. That's a healthy development, I'd have to say. Right? There's something they call founder's disease. in companies and in governments as well. That the people who start things, if they run it for longer than a certain amount of time, rot sets in. A dynasty was not formed. He did not try to make any of his children into the leaders of South Africa. He didn't even try to make his faction, the party, leaders of South Africa, necessarily. 10 years ago, things looked very bad in South Africa. 5 years ago, things looked bad. This is not a bad time right now. There's actually it's a peaceful time. There's stabilization. There's the really gross shift to inequality that happened during the first decade of this century is starting to see some writing, some corrections. There are some smart development things being done in South Africa. The leadership is not great. Things are not perfect. I think the next generation coming up in politics, who will start to emerge in the next election, might prove to be very hopeful. I think there's reason to be optimistic about the future.
Eve.
I mean, I have to pitch in here. I don't necessarily agree, given what's been going on over the past year at least. There have been massive protests. Unemployment in South Africa is so rife that I personally got offers from firms looking to export Canadian and American and French talent instead of actually hiring from the very poor education system in South Africa. The Black Economic Empowerment Scheme is failing, and it's leading to very big structural problems in the labor market and just the way the economy is structured. So I think Mandela's solution was ideal for his context, but there is a changing context here, and the ANC solution is not adapting. So it's one of the few times I was listening to Hard Talk on BBC, and I think even there's still a 60+% approval rate for the ANC despite the problems right now. And there is a huge, there's a leading upcoming white opposition figure who's going to get a lot more votes than any white predecessor before, from what the BBC was saying about a year ago. Maybe I'm mistaken. But I'm just saying that there's a changing context, and the ANC solution so far doesn't prove to be up to the challenge, and they really need to reframe for better leadership. I don't see it happening yet.
The deputy president was here last week of South Africa speaking at an event that we hosted, the chamber hosted. And there's a lot of discussion. It was interesting to see the different dynamics. So you have the resource companies who are concerned about resource nationalization, right? However, they have no problem dealing with China, who has very strict rules on how foreign companies come in. So you see this contradictory. China has this big market. We got to figure, we don't like the rules we're going to play because we want access to that market. South Africa and the Southern African SADC, the region, is over 250 million people and growing. The economy's going quite well. And then when it comes to their rules, we have a problem with resource nationalization. Now we got a problem. So he came and he spoke about how they're making reforms, they're working on reforms, they need input from the business community and from the social community. I think an issue that has to be spoken about, where I think Mandela's legacy really shines through, is that there's an increasing amount of the new generation of business leaders in South Africa, especially in the IT sector. Trying to figure out how do we diversify away from mining. But as well, there's still a lot of platinum in the ground, and some Canadian mining firms want access to that platinum to create fuel cell cars, right? So it's figuring out the BEE program, how you take social responsibility issues and move that forward. That's a legacy of Mandela. The problem is, it's not Mandela now, because he did what he had to do, and I love him, I respect him. The problem is right now is that you have governments around the world, including ours too many times, who want to overlook that to get to what's in the ground. I'm not looking at diversity. And for South Africa itself today, sort of the ANC not modernizing, how do you modernize different industries? How do we, there's talk about how do we increase the health, the film industry, the IT industry, the other industries. They're struggling with this. So I get many calls from South African firms saying, do you want to come? My first question is, what environment are you creating based on Mandela's legacy per se, that's going to create an environment to say, if I come, I could do knowledge transfer sharing, so I don't have to stay there for 40 years and be the guy who has the BMW. Make the people there be the ones who have the BMW, not me. I'll drive it up here.
Well done.
Let me put a new issue on the table here, which is Nelson Mandela was there for some of the most amazing moments in the history of the world. The first South African president meeting the first Black American president, which is a moment that just,
Unreal.
I mean, it's unreal, it is. Does that resonate for you?
Oh, most definitely. I think, I know I shed a tear the day Mandela walked out of prison. I shed a tear when Obama was elected. So to be able to see that meeting, it's very similar to the picture that Rad spoke about with Martin, Malcolm, and Mandela, because we grew up seeing these figures as icons of struggle and of using yourself as a platform to help others achieve. So I never thought I would live to see a day where there could possibly be a black president in the United States. So to live and to see that happen, and then to see this meeting between Obama and Mandela, it's a surreal thing. And I have a 6-year-old daughter now, and she doesn't know of a world that doesn't exist without a black president. So that's a new reality that she's going to be growing up in, where
your daughter's reality is a black president of the United States and a
Yes.
black president of South Africa.
and she knows
exciting.
nothing else.
That's amazing. Jerry, do you remember that first Mandela-Obama meeting and what you thought?
I always see the world as half full and half empty, and there's no better example of it than South Africa today. And since I always prefer to be unhappy, I always see everything as half empty. But I feel the same way about racism. On the one hand, yes, we have Obama, and the most famous and beloved person in the world is a black man. What do you do with that? Who would have thought that? The 3 most beloved people in history, can I write a column on this? Yeah. Are Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela. Three men of color, right? Who would have thought that's possible? And yet I have no doubt whatsoever that racism is alive and well through a great deal of the world. You already talked about stopping and frisking black guys in Toronto. The stopping and frisking of black guys and Latinos in New York has been a scandal for years.
Happening in the Dominican Republic.
Happened in the Dominican Republic. The number of Americans who hate Obama when all is said and done, and what motivates the Tea Party is he's a black man, for crying out loud. So we are
Well, let me push back a little bit on that.
there are some
elements in the Tea Party that don't like Obama. This is way off topic, but I know people who are watching this who are more conservative than you, Jerry, are going to get mad at me if I don't push back and say they care as much about fiscal stuff as they do about the fact
They do,
that,
but this has been probed a great deal, and there are a lot of Americans who will never reconcile themselves to this black president. So for reasons that I don't understand, racism is alive and well in parts of the world, and yet we have this terrible paradox. Which one is going to win out? I don't think we know yet.
Doug, I wonder whether you wish that Mandela's democratic tentacles, if I can put it this way, would have spread further afield. Yes, South Africa was spared the awful potential violence that a lot of people feared, but as you look north across the rest of Africa, did his ability to influence more democratic behavior on the rest of the continent? How would you gauge that?
Well, you only need to look a little bit north, of course, to Zimbabwe to see the dark potential of a very different type of transition, and what can happen if a leader does not engage in reconciliation, as Mugabe did. If the leader does not attempt to reconcile the country with the wider world. If there is a brutal sense of injustice in these things. Zimbabwe's fall into complete chaos and isolation from the wider world came almost exactly across the line with South Africa as it developed a normal economy and became part of the rest of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa is an interesting mix right now of hopeful leadership that has taken the sensible model and is moving in the right direction, and of the old post-colonial leaders who seize power, who hand it off to their children, who stay in power for many of their lives. There are too many old men in power in Sub-Saharan Africa right now. I think the average age of heads of state of African countries right now is, something like 60 years older than the average age of a citizen.
How old's Mugabe now? I mean, he's got to be
He's close
high
to
80s anyway.
Exactly. And he's not totally atypical, but there's a new generation. Some of the women who are taking countries in a different direction. There's the old man syndrome. Mandela was the first to break with it. Indeed, serving one term of office was a sign you don't have to have the old man syndrome. He managed to be an old man in repose who was looked up at as a symbol for his nation rather than somebody whose photograph was on every wall of every building. I think that's an accomplishment, and hopefully that model is starting to be the norm.
Yves.
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I mean, the democratic tentacle, I'd like to call it a rainbow. That's
Okay.
spreading. It is affecting other countries. I mean, even though sub-Saharan Africa is in fact still led by very old people who are not necessarily eager to relinquish power, Kenya, Ghana, many countries in North Africa, Mali now had a really decent return to peace, relatively. There's a big push for good governance on the continent, and some countries are responding better than others because of the economic push right now. There's strong economic promise on the continent, and that's actually driving a lot of economic, political, democratic reform. So Kenya is one of the very good examples. I mean, they had a conflict in 2008. It was bloody. I think about 82. I can't even put a number on it, but a lot of people died.
More than 1,000.
Okay, so that didn't happen. So that didn't happen again this year. Was it last spring, which is when the last elections were?
So that's progress.
That's progress, and Ghana has the same thing going on. I think they've had a good run of 3 past presidential elections without a civil war. So I mean, I think we're having a lot of progress. It's a mixed picture, but Mandela definitely did its parts.
Radcliffe.
I think when we look at the rest of Africa, this is something I wish in school they don't teach us this stuff in school. I always complain about that with my friends and colleagues. When you look at Africa itself, South Africa's experience is a bit unique than a lot of the other countries as well. There's a similar issue of colonialism and racism, but Congo's history is they had a democratically elected prime minister, and King Leopold's ancestors decided to put the boots to him and the CIA.
Yeah.
So there's issues all across Africa where you see this consistent trend of the colonizer still sticking their nose in and causing problems. A lot of those leaders today were educated by the same colonizer and maintained the same mentality for economic reasons. You look at how they kissed up some of the oil companies, how they allowed this to happen in their countries. South Africa, I mean, you speak to South Africans, being on the board of the chamber, I get a chance to meet many South Africans and having this conversation, forget all the media hype. What was it like for you and your family during apartheid? One gentleman who's a vice president now of a finance firm in South Africa said to me, we didn't even know black people, we didn't even know about Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. We didn't even know about Bob Marley in Zimbabwe, singing their independence. We didn't even know about Malcolm X. We didn't know this. See, so there's a context of where they're coming from, whereas the people in Congo knew what was going on in America. The people in they knew what was going on in Jamaica. They knew Bob Marley's music in Gabon, right? But South Africa, they were blocked off from the world, many people. So there was the external protests that helped bring it down. But people, he told me when we came out, we were saying, what are you talking about, this stuff about Bob Marley? Who's that? That they didn't know. So you're looking at a different context. So when Nelson Mandela's now free and leading, he starts to see what's going around the world, he may say, let's work on X, Y, and Z. But the African experience is so different across Africa. That's the problem again. We talk about Africa as if it's one place, right? Africa's many different countries and many different ethnic groups and cultures within a culture.
Yep.
And I think that's where we have to be careful when we say, why didn't it spread? Well, in Zimbabwe, we talked about earlier, there's a Lancaster House agreement no one wants to talk about in the Western media. That, Tony Blair's government broke a promise. They broke an explicit promise, and the Western media doesn't want to cover this story. So I'm not saying Mugabe is Saint Mugabe by any means, but I'm saying that, you look at where Zimbabwe started from. Zimbabwe was doing good initially, and then Lancaster House broke loose, and Mr. Mandela had to deal with that same pressure. What are you going to do about land reform? There is land reform in South Africa, but they're going about it differently, right? Mugabe took a different approach because he had pressure from the people who put him there. So I think we talk about Africa and overall, we have to be careful in that context because we could have you could have a series going on for 50 shows talking about Africa, as you know, Jerry.
Sadly, we don't have 50 shows. In fact, we don't even have this program anymore. We're done. We're out of time. I want to thank all 5 of you for coming in on this very historic day to help us remember the biggest legend I can ever
Probably of our time.
of our time.
No one like
right?
him.
There's nobody like him. There's a Nelson Mandela School in Toronto, and I hope some smart assignment editor at a TV station somewhere sends some cameras out there and
The
talks
vice
to the
principal on
kids.
the radio.
CBC
Great.
Radio.
Good.
Young and Dundas at the movie
Good.
theater right now.
Good. That's a smart thing to
The
do.
movie's coming out shortly.
I also should say, this is kind of funny, but some people have observed on Twitter tonight that we just so happen to have the Jets and the Sharks on opposite sides of the table. We're not trying to.
We noticed that ourselves.
We actually weren't trying to recreate West Side Story here. It's just kind of the way you guys all walked in. But
Both me didn't know I was black.
It's post-apartheid color coding.
And one more thing, we have collected some memories of Nelson Mandela on our website. I hope people will go there. Bob Ray gave us a wonderful interview about the fact that the second time he met Nelson Mandela, Mandela went to him and said, "We've met before." With all of the tens of thousands of people this man met, and he remembered that he had met Bob Ray years earlier. Some wonderful stories there, anyway, and memories, and we thank you tonight for yours. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming in tonight on such short notice as we remember Nelson Mandela.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.